Dr. Joe Carney and PJ Cunningham were my guests back in 2017. Through their publishing house in Bray, County Wicklow, they co-edited and compiled a book From the Candy Store to the Galtymore. They gathered stories from those who'd enjoyed the heydays of the ballroom romance, such as the Mayfair and Kilkenny, and then on arriving in England, heading to the Galtee, the Bamba, the Gresham, the Hibernian, the National, and many, many more dance halls. Now, contributors to the book were Father Brian Darcy, whom I interviewed recently for the programme, also Margot O'Donnell. The special aspect of the book was that it gave an opportunity for those who had never been in print before to have accounts published. Now, joining me to recap on the success of the book and to discuss his next project, Stories from the GAA Grassroots, is PJ Cunningham. PJ, lovely to speak to you again.
Lovely to speak to you too, Jerry.
PJ, with the restrictions we face, happy memories sustain us. It's great that we can look back on the great nights that we all had in the London Irish Centre in Camden when you launched the hugely popular From the Candy Store to the Galtymore. You were delighted with the reaction and the big crowd who turned out.
Well, they were swinging out of the rafters that night, if you recall. It was a great night for us. The fact that we were able to bring people from who had been exiled to London, if you say, or other parts of Britain, it was brilliant to have so many of them there that night. Some of whom I knew myself. Funny enough, young lads who used to play on teams I had even turned up on the night. Now, they wouldn't have been in the candy store or didn't know what it was about, but they found it a really interesting occasion to talk to people who had been in London, in the Greater London area since the 50s and 60s, and how they managed to bring part of Ireland with them at the time, which was very important. And the most important thing was the social gathering. And the most important part of that, of course, was the showband revolution, which was taking place, as you probably remember, a bit like myself in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, having someone like Margot, who wrote a great piece for us, Life-Changing Encounter, where she met a guy who had become a down and out there and told a beautiful story about how she helped to get him back and died with dignity in Ireland. And there was great stories also from different parts of London, not just people who had been born and reared in Ireland, but people like Catherine Murphy, who were first generational, if you like, and they were able to see what being Irish meant through the prism of their parents and their aunts and uncles who were there. So it was a beautiful, it certainly was historical, it certainly was social, and it definitely was cultural. The whole effect. And we were over for a weekend, as you remember, Jerry, because you were there. And it was wonderful to talk to people who still had the Mayo accent, who still had the Bog accent like myself from the Midlands, and who still had their Dublin accents half a century later, but still very much English in terms of their having made their life, the greater part of their life in England, and brought their families up in England, but still very much Irish in their heart, because when they put their head down on the pillow at night, they invariably went back to wherever they were brought up from, and it's the stories of their childhood. And even they would have done things like my colleague Joe Carney, who wrote the book with me. Joe would have been a 17-year-old who started out in the dance halls in Kilkenny and Callan, around that area, and he went seamlessly from one Friday night in Callan to one Saturday night in the Galtymore, and it was as if he hadn't left Ireland at all, you know, and queues half a mile long down the road trying to get into it, and then only Irish accents, and very much either talking about Gaelic football and hurling or talking about the dances and who was there and who was there from home. So, the book helped us probably write maybe what you might call a first draft of history on that time in people's lives. And we got great feedback. You know, even, would you believe, this Christmas gone by, a lovely lady had only heard about the book and had sent me over a check and asked me, and I was delighted that it got there for Christmas. And I was delighted as well, Jerry, that it was a situation that we didn't bring it out last year, because if we did, can you imagine books? You wouldn't have been able to have a launch over in London. You wouldn't have been able to get books over or back. And, you know, I feel sorry for anyone who had big projects planned last year that everything was put on hold or was only came out very much as a fraction of what they had planned to get done. And I suppose it's all our lives has been the same. We had to put them on hold and learn a lot about ourselves in the small situation that has been our home, because most of us have been confined to barracks, as they say here, for the last 12 months, or for the large part of the last 12 months anyway.
Indeed. Now, the book is still available in London via your website. I'll also be giving stockists later on. Now, some of those stories featured or greatly inspired. Mayo man Mark McGaugh, his story of the fight for a fair lady was touching. A shy lad crossing the Irish Sea to win the heart of a young lady from a flashy rival. Now, Mark's gone on to publish a book in his own right, Gold in Them There Tills. You must get some great satisfaction out of that, PJ.
Yeah, well, Mark is a Mayo man. I think he went over in 59, 58, maybe 59. And Mark found himself as being a very good footballer, but he was also a very good entrepreneur. And I think he made his money through tills. So Gold in Them There Tills is what he came up with. But it was through his stories with me here, and the one, as you say, he wrote about fighting for the fair maid that he won over to be his wife, that he said to me, would there be possibility of doing a book? And I'd like to launch it in Ireland and then launch it in London as well. So it was good that, I think it was the year before Mark's book came out, Jerry, and it was a lovely book reminiscing about the various times at home on the farm with his mum and dad and his siblings, and then going out and starting out in England with 2 jobs and not being afraid of work and building up his little empire. And I think he did very, very well, and he loved playing a game of golf, and he loved to come back to watch Mayo play, and he loved to keep the Irish angle open in his lifetime. And it was like, again, if I was surprised, Jerry, when I went to London and found that the Irish club was full that night when you were there, I was equally surprised that when we went down to launch in Mayo in the hotel, that there was a full house again. And here's for a man who hadn't really, who had been in exile since 1958, 59 to 2019 or whatever it was, well over 50 years, nearly 60 years. And he was still fated through the fact that he had brothers and sisters, through the fact that one of his nephews was working in the one of the local radios in Mayo. And it was brilliant that it was all able to translate back into a lifetime, and it was a shared lifetime because people were coming up to him. I remember you playing then, and I saw you when you came home that time with your wife when you were on your honeymoon. And, our human life passes by very quickly, Jerry, as those of us who have hit 60 and plus are starting to see very, very clearly. And it is lovely in many instances that what we have done in our life just doesn't die with us, or isn't just a little bit of word of mouth. That if it is committed to print, it's there for posterity, not just for your own kids and maybe your grandkids, but for people who maybe were your neighbours or people who grew up in the same era as you grew up in, that they're able to say, oh God, my life was like that too. Yes, I went over to England on the boat the same as Mark did. Yes, I had 2 jobs the same as he had. And I know, I spoke to Mark because you're talking about the book we're doing now, a GA book. Mark has a lovely story in that about cutting his brother so that he could go off and play a final. And he wrote about the final in his own book. In fact, when he was home only recently, like that time in 2019, he was presented with a medal, because I think the medal he had won was presented at a function months after he had left Ireland to go and work in England, and he got his minor medal 60 or 70, 60 years later, which was a brilliant little story in itself,
Indeed, and no doubt people will have more time on their hands with the way things are, and many may like to get actually involved in the legacy of GAA stories, which you're keen to capture. What is your aim in it, PJ, to capture the stories?
Well, I tell you, we're nearly at the end of doing it now, Jerry. I have been working on it since last May, June, where I sent out a circular to the London papers like the Irish World and Post and all the other places that it could in Ireland as well, the Irish Independent, all the local newspapers. And we've got a fantastic response, because what I tried to do this time around, Jerry, is say, look, everyone knows who Christy Ring is, and everyone knows who all the top names are, but not too many people played pushpenny with Christy Ring. But a man came forward and told me a fascinating story about playing pushpenny. So what I said to people that was writing a story for me, look, I don't want you to tell me about people winning 9 All-Irelands or being a chairman for 50 years. That's normally recorded in club histories or in county histories or in GAA books of famous people. What I want are the stories from the grassroots. People on the sideline, getting up to things. People who ref the match for their own club and did something saucy. And the amount of stories that have come in, and, they're from club players, county players, but they're, in the main, they're not from players. They're from ordinary people. The ordinary people who might line a pitch or might just be supporters that might have nothing to do with the GAA, and to tell, now, Niall Quinn is a case in point. You'll remember Niall Quinn as a great Irish soccer player.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, and he played with Sunderland and he was chairman of Sunderland and all that sort of stuff. But Niall, when he came back to live in Kildare, he was very friendly with the local parish priest, because he was a good man to go to Cheltenham, and he knew him through Cheltenham. And the parish priest said, listen, I have a match to play next Tuesday night. And Niall went up to play the match, and he was surprised that the place was full. And it only dawned on him that Father, the priest, was well known for for getting a big crowd in. A good gate was more money for the club, And what he had done was, he told everyone, Niall Quinn will be the star attraction. But he hadn't told the manager. And the manager had an unwritten rule: unless you train, you don't play. So here they are, they're fighting on the sideline, the priest and the manager. And he said, oh, geez, put him in for a few minutes. And you know my rule, Father. Well, he said, look, I know your rule, but there'll be a riot here if he doesn't get on for a few minutes. Because I told Kildare Radio, and I told the Evening Herald, and I told the Leinster leader that he's going to be a star and to bring their young lads down, and he'll give autographs after he plays. And if he doesn't show up now, or if he's not allowed onto the pitch, to be huge disappointment. So now he got on and he played. And as he said himself, look, I didn't do too badly. I got a few scores, and I was happy to end my GAA career at that. But then the manager saw that he had actually played well and said, listen, we have a real big match next week now against local rivals, Salons. So come down and train, and you'll definitely start. Now, as it happened, it was just after the time of Saipan and the 2002 World Cup, which we got to the quarterfinals and were beaten on pens, if you remember, you see. So Niall played full forward, and he played very well. He was pulled down for 3 penalties, and he scored 3 penalties. But the young lad, at the end of it, he felt a bit sorry for the young lad in goal. So when the match was over, he went over to shake his hand and said, look, geez, you did very well. You nearly saved that last penalty. And your man said, would you ever go to you know where? When we wanted you to take a penalty out in Japan, you were nowhere to be seen. You're a great lad today, sticking 3 past the young lad. See? And there was further stories like that. And it ends up with Niall and the young lad, even though that they had a row there, and then they somehow come together again by the end of the story and become very good friends. But they're the sort of stories that will never appear in a winner's catalogue, if you like, Jerry. But they're the sort of stories that, another one in Kilkenny, where it's obviously a mad hurling county, but this man was trying to get the young lads to play football. And he told them he wouldn't pick them for the hurling juvenile team unless they played football. So against their will, these lads had to travel in a minibus and in his car halfway across the county. And when they got there, the man saw, well, none of these lads have started shaving this week. They're not juveniles. They were more like under 21s he was playing against. And he said, how am I going to get this, ever live this down? But anyway, at half time he noticed that there was only 1 ball between the 2 teams. And while they were being hockeyed, there was something like 8-8 to no score at half time. He said to the biggest lad on his own team, he said, look, the first chance you get that ball, I kick it out into that cornfield out next door, and I'll take it from there. So it was about 10 minutes before they got their hands on the ball. But true to his word, the biggest lad he had on the team, he massive kick out into the middle of the corn. And this is August time of year where the corn is high in the field and it's ready for harvesting. But and obviously when the ball landed, it went and disappeared. But the trainer saw where it disappeared, and he had his penknife out. People smoked pipes that time back in the 60s. And of course, the first thing he did was he stabbed the ball and left the penknife behind him and ran back to the lads. He said, "Jesus, lads, it must have landed on a big rock or something. It's starting to lose its air. Have we another ball at all?" So they hadn't another ball. But anyway, the moral of the story was the game had to be called off, and we played in the other teams. Wingap was the name of the other team. So they had to come to Wingap, and the trainer told the lads on the way home. He said, "Lads," he said, "if these lads had under 21s playing for them tonight, wait till you see the seniors we have playing against them next week." So they won the juveniles that year, but they didn't win it by fair means. But then again, as was often the case back in the 60s, being overage was only a mere oversight. It didn't really stop teams from playing fellas who were way older than they should have been, Jerry, if you know what I mean.
Indeed. Now, the history of the GAA spans 136 years now. Between the stories handed down through generations and eyewitness accounts from the pitch and the dressing room, the stories, some of the stories you've just told me, the handball alley and the boardroom must be excited about getting diverse, original takes on your topic.
Yeah, and I have handball stories, I have camogie stories, I have score stories. There's everything in there. But you just have to remind me, actually, a very good point. I have two cracking stories, one of which I think is an exclusive, so I can't really tell you about it. But the day Michael Hogan was killed in Bloody Sunday in 1921, is it, in Dublin, November the 21st, 1920, or November the 20th, 1920? I'm a bit mixed up. I'll find it out for you in a second and tell you. But there was a situation where this man, who's now in his 70s, was talking to his mother one day. There was a program on RTE television about Croke Park was being rebuilt at the time. And the mother, who he had never heard speaking about football in her life, said, "I was there on Bloody Sunday." And the son said, "You are not, mother, were you? What were you doing there?" And she said, "I was Mick Hogan," as she called him. "I was Mick Hogan's girlfriend." And I have looked it up since and before, and I've never heard the story of Mick Hogan's girlfriend being there on the day. Now, not only that, but she had to survive the barrage of shooting that was there, went back to a place in Slunskee where the Tipperary team and supporters normally met up with, and found out that her boyfriend was killed. And then she had to go, and she married an Armagh man afterwards, and they had children and all that. But she kept it quite a secret until the latter days. She was in her 90s when she revealed to her son. And the son went and checked then with other people in the family who had lived in Tipperary and said, "Oh yeah, they used to talk about their mum and Mick as an item here for years." But it was only done locally. It never, as I was saying to you earlier about stuff, it was never consigned to print so that it would last forever, if you know what I mean. So that was one story. And then there was another great story. I only spoke to the grandson last week, a fellow called David Carl, but his grandfather's name was Yarra Duffy, Christy Duffy, but his nickname was Yarra. He was called after a river in Australia, and the river was the name on a boat at Dublin Docks, which he used to play in. And the mother said, "Sure, that fellow's down in Yarra the whole time," so she started calling him Yarra. But he was a 15-year-old that was shot in the neck, and the bullet split in two, and he was nearly killed. But again, not very well known. He went on to have a very, very glittering career, winning Leinster medals and national leagues with Dublin right into the 20s and 30s, and went over to work in England during the war and came back and had a great life, and was fated in later life by his club, St. Joseph's, which is now defunct. It has amalgamated with some other club. But we got stories. If I had an hour, I could run you through of 150 to 200 stories. I mightn't be able to get them all in, but a great story about London too, where a fella was sent off in London on Sunday after morning, the 11 o'clock match. He was sent off. In fact, he got himself sent off because his team was winning over there, and he had to catch a plane back to play in the Tyrone Championship in the afternoon, in the evening, should I say. And with about 10 minutes to go, he was afraid he might miss the plane, so he hit a fella box, and the ref sent him off, which meant he got to the plane in time, just about in time. The plane landed in Belfast. He jets down to somewhere in Tyrone. The match is 10 minutes from start, and he gets in and he starts, and he gets sent off in Tyrone. So he's the only man known to have been sent off in 2 countries in the one day, playing 2 championship matches.
Absolutely cracking.
So, they're the sort of stories, Jerry. Look, I honestly could bring it through. There isn't a bad story in them. My regret is I might either have to do a second book, or I might have to leave stories out and just put them into the GA archives or something like that, you know.
Right. Now, if somebody wants to, if somebody would like to contact you, the email address is simple, and I can give it to anybody if you miss it. It's pj@gaastories.ie. The website address is Ballpoint Press, where you can find out more. Now, if somebody has a story, should they get in touch with you first off to let you know their angle, and you'll take it up with them from there? Yeah.
What I do is, there are an awful lot of people who will say to me, my father was chairman of such and such a club for 50 years. I think that's a record. Or something. And I said, look, is it in the local GL? Oh, it is, yeah, it's all in. I said, no, that's a great story for you know, what it's wanted. Like, it's not the type of story I'm looking for, the unusual story. A bit of blackguardism, like your man bursting the ball. Something about a fella playing in 2 different counties, like bangers. I could tell you stories about those, Jerry, till the cows come home, because we've got a huge amount of them. And if there's people in England, and I have some other great stories, a great journalist here, Barry Henriquez, he lives in Kilkenny, but he's a tune man by birth. He went over to live in England in Manchester, and he played football over there, and he did a great story about going down to London at the time that the bombings in London, and he was in whatever the courts in London are on the day it was bombed, and it made him come back to live in Ireland. It's a story full of pathos about what being living in England at that time meant, because there were police officers up at GA matches in Manchester every Sunday morning, just seeing, you know, who might be subversives, as they would have seen it. Because don't forget, an awful lot of people felt that IRA, stroke and the GA were the one thing. Particularly British people didn't understand that, and an awful lot of Irish were wrongly labelled and wrongly had to go to serve time or were arrested on false pretenses. And Barry gets this across really well. So there's and then there's probably the most poignant story of the lot is Joe Carney, my pal, did a story about being in London on the afternoon of an All-Ireland hurling final, and he was in Hyde Park, and he saw this fella listen to a transistor, and then he could hear Micheál O'Hare's voice, and he went up and talked to this total stranger, and they're there. One is from Kilkenny, one is from Cork. They're for different teams, but there's a union there. There's a bond there because it's the call of the Irish. It's the call of the Gaels. And it's so sad. It almost makes me cry thinking of it now. Joe is a great wordsmith, as you know, and he captured it so well that, you know, it's a must for any book, you know, when you have that sort of ability that you can call on.
Indeed so. And if somebody needs help, you know, in sort of getting the story, you know, out, you can assist them on it and all that.
What I do is I tell the people, it's your story, tell it to me, and I will write it up for you, and it will appear under your name, because it's your story, you know, it's not my story, and I'm not trying to claim it, and it's written in the first person piece, every story. What I might be able to do is, some people don't have the confidence to say, I can't write it, but I can talk it. And you know what, there's very little difference, but after 50 or 40 years in journalism, I have enough confidence to write a story for anybody. And sometimes the best, Keith Barr, who was the great Dublin player, I rang him yesterday because somebody told me he had a great story to tell. And of course, Keith would say, I don't even know if I have any stories. But within an hour of talking to Keith, there were they were coming across the waterfall, like water cascading down on me. And I'm right, as you rang me there today now, I'm writing that story, which will appear in Keith's name. And it is such a seriously funny story because Keith is a funny guy. And basically, I let him tell the story and he writes it himself without realising. All I do is put in full stops and capital letters at the beginning of sentences.
Great. Now, Joe Horan, as the president of the GAA, agrees that there's a need to explore and publish story, indeed, from the grassroots point of view. PJ, listen, we look forward to the publication. So many people will relate to the subject matter as they're passionate about GAA and all the Irish sports. So, any idea when roughly the book will be available?
Well, I tell you, what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to bring an end to it. So I plan to bring the guillotine down on books, on stories coming in by the end of March. I planned to work on then the proofing and the correcting and the editing in April. And then it goes through publishing and printing process. So if all goes well, I'd hope to have it out by midsummer, maybe into August, so that it'll be there then. And look, it's not a book that's going to just sell for Christmas or something like that. It's a book that I hope, my plan is not for it to just be, something that comes and goes. It's something that people can refer to and say, look, there's so many good stories in that book. And I'm not trying to take credit for that. It's the people who have given me the stories. But I did know, Jerry, a bit like yourself, you've had a drink at a pub and you hear people telling stories. Say, why hasn't somebody written these down? And then I said to myself, well, look, if no one has done it, why don't you do it? And I'm delighted I did that because it's been a lockdown year for a lot of people, but it's been a year of great joy for me because every day, if you think 150 days, every other day, you're talking to people and they're giving you a bit more about a story and they're coming back with another reminisce. And between the lot, I've had so many people that I didn't know before this began last June that I now would consider almost friends, even though some of them I haven't met at all. But it's just talking so often to them, you build up a rapport, if you know what I mean, Terry.
Indeed. Now, whilst we eagerly await the stories from the GAA grassroots, why not read, if you haven't done so already, from the Candy Store to the Galtymore? You can see our website for London stockists. The book is also available from ballpointpress.ie for other great titles also. That's also the website in search for in-depth details of stories from the GAA grassroots initiative, a work in progress. And if anyone's got a story, just contact PJ, or you can go on our website. Also, there's a link on our website to it all, irishradio.org. PJ, listen, please join me again when the new book is available. And listen, it's been lovely to catch up with you again. Stay safe and well.
Same to you, Jerry. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.